It's really great to be here this morning to talk to you about something that I get very, very excited about. So yeah, as Matt said, I am Conservation Manager at Corrour. I'm doing a PhD on mountain woodland restoration and chair of the Mountain Woodland Action Group. So I'm absolutely fascinated, obsessed with high altitude trees, but also Arctic alpine plants in general. And today's talk's going to be very much a hybrid between my research, my PhD, and also my work at Corrour. So explaining how we can put into practice the outputs of research to actually deliver restoration projects on the ground. So I will introduce mountain woodland, talk about the benefits, why it's important to restore it, give you some of the key highlights of my PhD research. Then with a few case study examples, particularly our work at Corrour, and then finish with pulling everything together with a kind of wider look across Scotland and aspirations for the future. So my PhD is based at University of Stirling, and common question I'm getting asked at the moment is, when are you going to finish? So the answer to that is sometime next year, so soon. I'm writing up at the moment anyway. So these are just a few slides of me in the field to get us started, out measuring high altitude trees for my PhD and also my work, which takes me to some very extreme locations, which means that point about health and safety is very relevant to what I've been doing, hanging off cliff ledges. So what is mountain woodland? Well, it's actually curiously difficult to define in detail because there's not really one habitat type. It's very much a transition zone, a mosaic of lots of different habitats. We kind of broadly mean where trees and shrubs grow in the mountains from about 450 meters altitude up, or about 600 meters up for the sort of Arctic alpine specialist montane vegetation. And it's also called the tree line, the transition from where trees grow completely upright all the way up to their upper altitudinal climatic limits. And it's just really fantastic as a mosaic of lots of different species, habitats, also plenty of open ground, all intermingling, and the trees get gradually more stunted and stunted as you go up the hill. Species like Scots pine, birch, rowan, and some of my favourites, the Arctic alpine willow species. But despite being someone who makes this my career, it's actually quite difficult to get photos of sort of healthy, abundant mountain woodlands in Scotland. Because most of what we have actually looks a lot like this. So we've experienced widespread habitat loss of trees in our uplands, particularly in the last few hundred years due to overgrazing by large herbivores, other pressures as well, such as burning, which has pushed these really palatable trees and shrubs onto inaccessible cliff ledges, largely out of the reach of the grazing animals, where they're literally clinging on for dear life. Some of these species are very rare and endangered. Montane willow scrub in the 1990s was thought to cover just an area of about 10 hectares across the whole of Scotland, with the largest kind of patch of willows about the size of a tennis court. And mountain birch, or high altitude downy birch, well, we've lost so much of that we sort of tend to forget that we maybe even had it in the first place. And in fact, a lot of what we have is the picture here at the bottom, where there's a complete loss of trees and shrubs very widely across the upland landscape. So from a conservation and botanical perspective, these are some of the key highlights. The Arctic alpine specialist montane willows, and these are all, well, nationally rare in the case of the woolly willow, and the other 5 are nationally scarce species. Woolly willow and waterleaf willow are listed as endangered to extinction. The rest are listed as vulnerable. And they're really, really wonderful, charismatic upland shrubs. I've also included dwarf birch in there as one of the key study species of my PhD, which I'll talk about in a short while. So there's obviously biodiversity benefits in terms of restoring the actual Arctic alpine trees and shrubs themselves. But there's many widespread benefits as well of restoring mountain woodland in Scotland. So other biodiversity benefits. This habitat is fantastic for upland birds, invertebrates. So species of bird like ringouzel, which are declining elsewhere in the country, absolutely love mountain woodland. And there's species of sawfly, which are host specific. So they're entirely dependent on an individual species of montane willow for their survival. So if we lose the willows, we lose them. As well as the biodiversity, there's also benefits that are what we call nature-based solutions. So if you have trees and shrubs on steep mountain slopes, they will protect the slopes from erosive forces such as landslides, avalanches, rockfalls, and also stabilize the soil, prevent against soil erosion. And having the trees and shrubs also slows the flow of water over and through the montane soils, which has been shown to reduce the risk of downstream flooding. So all of these nature-based solutions are going to be critically important for mitigating the impacts of extreme weather events that we're seeing due to climate change. And I've summed up these points in a review paper on the benefits of mountain woodland restoration, published through my PhD. There we go. So to move on to talk about perhaps the most important site for mountain woodland restoration in Scotland, which is Ben Lawes National Nature Reserve, owned and managed by the National Trust for Scotland, which many of you might be aware as being the most important place for Arctic alpine plants, rare plants in general. But it's also fantastic for mountain woodlands. I worked there for 10 years as a seasonal ecologist, and it was very much the inspiration for my whole career. The National Trust for Scotland have been pioneering mountain woodland restoration for 40 odd years now, at just a scale and longevity that is unmatched anywhere else in the country. So it's just a fantastic place to see the habitat and also for studying it for my PhD. But in the 1980s, this landscape was largely devoid of trees, apart from a few just clinging on to cliff ledges. But there was a challenge with grazing because there's heritable grazing rights. So much of the hill was grazed by sheep farmers at the bottom of the hill. So the National Trust for Scotland managed to combat that by putting in a series of fenced exclosures, the largest of which was 800 hectares in size, including land all the way up to 900 meters in altitude. And they planted it with, well, hundreds of thousands of trees, including several tens of thousands of montane willows, creating the largest patch of restored montane willow scrub and also sub-montane birchwood as well. So a fantastic place to carry out my research. But it's always nice to show some before and after pictures, just the stark change from 1990, where there were basically no trees, and then to today. So some of these trees, a lot of them have been planted, but now there's natural regeneration occurring as well. So it's actually difficult to know what has been planted and what hasn't, which is absolutely wonderful. This transition from sub-montane birchwood all the way up to montane scrub at the higher altitudes. So this is my study site for my PhD, and it contains tens of thousands of downy willow, Salix laponum, which was the species I studied. And there's quite a lot of variability in the growth of this species. They were planted about 20 years ago, but some of them are really, really big and some of them not so. And I just thought it would be really interesting to look at the growth of these individual plants and relate that to the surrounding environment where they've been planted, to try and understand perhaps what conditions promoted the best growth rates, but also which conditions hadn't been so good for planting, and that means that we can avoid planting in those places in the future. So it's very much about improving the efficiency of restoration, but also testing the idea that when the National Trust for Scotland planted this site, they were often planting sites by choosing them based on their understanding of the current conditions where these plants grow in Scotland. So using the relict remnant populations as inspiration for creating new ones. So I wanted to see if that approach had actually produced good outputs. So I measured loads of different attributes and all the different surrounding abiotic biotic factors next to the shrubs. And it was absolutely fascinating. So some of the conditions which are representative of relict wild populations did help the growth of these shrubs. So for example, tall herb cover. If you plant in places where there's good tall herb, species like globeflower, wood cranesbill, greater wood rush, then that was quite good for the growth of these willows. But then there were other conditions, particularly to do with sheltering, soil characteristics, and particularly soil pH, that actually were perhaps in contrary to what we expected. So it seemed that it didn't really matter if you used pH conditions that were the same as the relict populations or not. They were quite happy growing in fairly acidic places, whereas we normally think of them as being quite calcareous loving species. So it seems that if you were to solely plant based on trying to recreate what's in the wild populations, then you could be restricting this species to a subset of conditions which it could optimally grow in. And that perhaps suggests that actually when we're planting, we could look at and think about going beyond simply recreating the present day habitat. Because when you think about it, what we have left in Scotland, it's a refugia. So these plants have been pushed to inaccessible cliff ledges because of overgrazing. So that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the optimum place for them to be. There could be wider opportunities that they're not occurring in anymore because of overgrazing. And perhaps that's something that we could think about incorporating into restoration projects to expand the habitat more widely. So a useful species to kind of test this idea with is dwarf birch, which is a lovely montane shrub. And in Britain, its distribution actually nowadays is largely associated with blanket bog habitats, which is quite interesting, perhaps not something that you would think about being associated with a tree. But this study by Wang et al., they used ecological niche modeling analysis, which showed that the species is actually adapted to a much wider range of habitats than just blanket bog. And in fact, it grows in a wider range elsewhere in Europe, particularly in grasslands and heathlands. So we wanted to test the hypothesis that perhaps dwarf birch was persisting in blanket bog in Britain because of management, particularly overgrazing and burning, having pushed it into these refugia areas. So we carried out a planting experiment for my PhD at 3 study sites. The first site was Ben Lawes, and that was all planted inside a fence. And the dwarf birch was planted in 3 habitats: bog, upland grassland, and upland heathland. Then we also repeated this at 2 other sites, Glenfinglas and Corrour. And for that, we also used an unfenced treatment. So at Corrour, they were planted inside the fence and then outside the fence at a deer density of below 3 per square kilometre. And at Glenfinglas, there was inside the fence and outside the fence, which was about 6 deer per square kilometre. Although the experiment actually ended up taking an interesting turn when I discovered that inside the fence at Glenfinglas, there was actually incursion by deer because the fence was in poor condition. But that was rather nice because it actually made an intermediate level of grazing between unfenced Corrour and unfenced Glenfinglas, so sort of about 3 to 6 per square kilometre. So I actually got a bit of a continuum of grazing to test whether blanket bog was indeed a refugia for dwarf birch from grazing. And the results of 6 years or so of measurements on these planted trees was fascinating. So the thick lines on this plot, this is the survival rate there for the fenced, ungrazed, well, not in the case of Glenfinglas, but in the case of Corrour and Ben Lawes, they're the ungrazed sites. And basically the survival rate was the same for all 3 habitats inside the fence at those sites. And actually the growth rates of the plants was the same. They were quite happy. If anything, they were actually growing better in the heath than the bog. But when you introduce grazing into the mix, the picture just completely changed. And you look at the Glen Finglas plot there with the dotted lines for the unfenced higher grazing treatment. And it was just incredible how it conformed to this view of Blanket Bog being a refugia, because the trees were less browsed in the Blanket Bog in the presence of large herbivores, and the survival rate was higher, but they were getting much more browsed and experienced mortality due to that browsing in the grasslands and the heathlands. And the same story actually true, but to a lesser extent in the fenced area with the medium level of grazing at Glen Finglas. So at higher deer densities, we saw lower survival browsing, higher browsing in the heath and the grass, but the bog seemed to be a bit more protected, which supports this view that Blanket Bog is a refuge for dwarf birch from overgrazing. And I think it highlights this idea of thinking outside the box when you're approaching restoration, or rather, in this case, thinking outside the bog, which is going to be the title of the paper that this is based on, about trying to move beyond just recreating current habitat fragments, which may be impoverished, and looking to create something much more diverse and more resilient to the future if you account for factors such as overgrazing and you can combat them. And it's actually fascinating if you go over to another National Trust in Scotland site, Mar Lodge, where they've been doing landscape scale deer reduction and across the whole of the regeneration zone, well below 3 deer per square kilometre. And there's a good seed source for dwarf birch there. And where is it regenerating really well? It's regenerating really well in the heathlands. It's absolutely fantastic. I've never seen dwarf birch like it in Scotland, and it gives you an idea of perhaps what we could have more of. But what's perhaps somewhat frustrating is that for this sort of dwarf birch heath community, there's not actually a formal habitat classification for that. It's not in the NVC. So we are thinking about working on restoring these habitats in protected sites. There's no recognition of that. It simply doesn't exist. So it's quite difficult to perhaps get it into policy. And that can be quite constraining. I think being reliant on these static classifications of vegetation types when perhaps there are more options out there. So thinking about more dynamic options for the future, which could incorporate systems such as this. So does that mean that we can perhaps just get going and just plant lots of mountain woodland across our uplands and get really excited about thinking outside the box and go for it for all the right reasons, benefits that I've discussed? Well, perhaps not. So there's a really interesting blog written by Andy Amphlett, who's the Vice County Recorder for Easterness, talking about a recent planting project on Corrour East and Cairngorms near the ski centre. And it's really interesting read. He outlines some of the perhaps problems, caveats with widespread planting schemes, which I think is really important to bear in mind when you're thinking about this sort of work. So planting species which haven't particularly got a distribution in the local area, using non-local provenances for that planting, and doing widespread planting of high numbers, high densities, and then particularly planting into novel habitats. So the photos here show some planting in alpine heath, which has got really thin, sensitive soils, which is not the sort of dry heath that I was studying in my PhD. It's completely different habitat. And it's a bit concerning that could cause some disturbance to sensitive montane habitats. So I think we should be careful not to sort of have a carte blanche and just rush in with all the best of intentions to plant sites like this. Perhaps a really good approach would be to, if you're planting novel species in novel habitats, is to carry out a smaller scale planting trial. So you can use science then to inform decisions about whether this should be scaled up or not. And Andy also made a really interesting point about, well, there's regeneration already occurring at this site for Scots pine, so shouldn't we be letting regeneration take the lead? Which, of course, what we were seeing at Mar Lodge with the dwarf birch. But it sort of raises this nice conundrum about where not to plant, or what about the right tree in the right place? Should we be planting or using natural regeneration? So that brings me to talk about my work at Corrour Estate, which is a private estate in the Western Highlands. And we're we've been embarking over the last 20 years on a programme of realigning management towards ecological restoration, largely driven by natural processes, and particularly letting natural regeneration take the lead by reducing the densities of red deer down to a level of about 3 per square kilometre to hopefully improve ecosystem health across the whole estate. Though I should say that although we're reducing deer are very much not seen as the enemy or the problem. They're a wonderful part of our cultural heritage, an iconic large mammal. And if you remove grazing completely, there can be all sorts of strange ecological processes. That's not natural either. So it's more about trying to find a balance between a sustainable, healthy deer population, but also facilitating natural regeneration. And it's wonderful to see that our long-term monitoring data across the hill shows an upward trend in the density of seedlings by natural regeneration. And natural regeneration is great for all sorts of reasons. The trees will choose the places best suited for them, rather than us having to make that decision or force them into where we think they should be. It's also better for carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and just general structural heterogeneity as well. So in Corrour, we're seeing really good regeneration of downy birch, particularly rowan, and also some of our willow species. And it's fantastic to see this when I'm out and about on the hill, these knee-high forests emerging in the uplands as they've been released from overgrazing. But there is still a case to plant, which kind of brings me somewhat back full circle, for our Arctic alpine willows. So these still occur on Corrour very sparsely across the hill. We've got about 150 individuals occurring across an area that's 19,000 hectares. So there's so few of them that there's just not going to be any capacity for regeneration on a meaningful scale. We might get a very limited amount of it, and we have seen that, but it's just going to be so small. If we're going to try and aim for widespread habitat restoration, we need to give it a helping hand, which is why we've been embarking on a restoration project of genetic rescue or supplementary planting, basically joining up the dots of these tiny fragmented remnant populations across the hill to create a much more contiguous habitat, which hopefully will bring wider benefits to the landscape, focusing on water-leaved willow and particularly downy willow as well. And this work is very, very involved because you can't readily get these species, well, particularly of local provenance, from tree nurseries. So we've actually had to go out and start from scratch by collecting cuttings and seed from the wild populations, and bearing in mind these plants are inaccessible to large herbivores. They're also inaccessible to me. So it's very demanding work, hanging off cliff ledges, collecting cuttings. And you have to be patient because it does take time to grow these species. So we've been working in collaboration with Trees for Life, who have been growing on our cuttings collected from as many plants as we can reach on Corrour. So they're all clones of plants from the wild. And then rather than plant them out directly on the hill, we've been planting them in what's called a seed stand. So then they'll all reproduce together to upscale the production of seed. We don't have to go back out on the hill to collect the seed. And then it's a hopefully genetically diverse stand of local provenance. And in the last couple of years, we've embarked on our restoration programme. Still early days, but we planted about 6,000 willows. And I've monitored a cohort of 480 individually tagged trees of that, all planted, I should say, outside of fences in the presence of a low density deer population. And it's been fantastic to see that we've got a 98% survival rate of those seedlings, which is really encouraging because this is all done without fencing. And using the outputs from my PhD to inform planting sites using indicator species such as tall herbs, I think has really given them a boost as well. So just to finish off, just bring us back out again and thinking about what's been going on elsewhere in Scotland, because there's so much now. It's really, really exciting that you can actually map the mountain woodland restoration areas on Scotland and actually like see it. It's tangible on a national scale of about 10,000 hectares. So that'll be an underestimate because this was done in 2023. So there's been a lot more in the last couple of years. So that's Ben Laws. Here's us at Corrour, and I should give a big shout out to the folks at Mar Lodge with the largest polygon on my map of 1,000 hectares of pine, Monte pine regeneration, which is just phenomenal. And plenty of other work by lots of the partners in the Mountain Woodland Action Group, lots of exciting work going on in West Africa with Trees for Life, and Borders Forest Trust doing incredible work in the borders where there's barely anything left. They've had to start from complete scratch. So it's, yeah, there's a lot going on, but I think still more to be done. This is where the squares on this map show where the downy willow has been planted so far in Scotland, in contrast to the dots where the wild fragmented populations are. I mean, it's pretty good, but there's definitely still spaces in that map where perhaps tiny declining populations could do with a helping hand, or at least we could start by collecting cuttings and seed from them to preserve their genetic diversity. And this is water-leaved willow, which has been planted perhaps a bit less, although there's definitely more uptake and work on this plant now. But again, lots of potential, particularly in the northwest of Scotland. We could really do a lot more at conserving and restoring the montane willows in those parts of Scotland. So to finish off, I've made this sort of collection of various aspirations for the future, what we could do to help restore this habitat more widely. Thinking about all mountain woodland habitats holistically, which of course is a wide amount of species and those that they support. So I think fundamentally we need to combat the original cause of habitat loss and population decline and manage large herbivores at the landscape scale for lower densities to encourage restoration, which will benefit many other species as well beyond just mountain woodland, lots of other grazing sensitive plants like tall herbs, for example, and even our peatlands, which are sensitive to trampling. Using this idea of thinking a bit more outside the box, not just conserving the tiny fragments and recreating impoverished fragments, which may be refugia. Getting mountain woodland far more integrated into national policy, which I appreciate might be difficult when there aren't even formal definitions for what some of these habitats could be, for example, the dwarf birch, but that needs to be changed for us to get them more widely recognised and uptake. And again, funding for this work, which requires long-term investment because these plants take a bit longer to grow than trees at a lower altitude, but it's well worth the patience to get there, as we've seen at Ben Laws. Action at much wider scales rather than just thinking about small projects within fences. What can we achieve across, well, whole estates and also whole regions as well, working in partnership. Propagating local material to enhance genetic diversity. And finally, enhancing employment and community engagement, particularly showcasing the role of deer stalkers who are important in delivering deer management, which underpins lots of the things that we're doing at Corrour, for example. And that's the end of my talk. Here are some of the key references.